everybody, what's up? Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about half an hour of history together each episode. My name is Jason Kishneff and we're reading Defining Moments in Black History by Dick Gregory. Reading chapter 4. Remember, if you enjoyed the episode, hit that like and subscribe button. Let's dig in. Hattie McDaniel's Oscar for Gone with the Wind. In 1936, a white lady named Margaret Mitchell published a novel called Gone with the Wind. It had more pages than 10 phone books, depending on if you live in Los Angeles or New York. The novel was set in the South during the Civil War. The Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865, 4 years. That's about how long it would take you to read Gone with the Wind. Not including the time you'd spend either falling asleep or stomping your feet and hollering over that racist bullshit. He says BS. I hope you don't mind that I'm saying bullshit. I don't think you do. In 1939, they released the movie version of Gone with the Wind. Folks flocked to see that piece of crap. It set all kinds of box office records and won just about every award Hollywood had to give out. Among other things, it was the first time a movie character said the word damn on screen. That's what I said when I saw it. Damn. Another thing the movie is known for, Hattie McDaniel, who plays a house slave, became the first black person to win an Academy Award. Her character is named Mammy. Black folks gave her a hard time for playing a black stereotype. Then when she was doing an interview and they asked her how she felt about always playing a maid, even with all her talent, here's what she said in response. I'd rather play a maid than be one. With that statement, she insulted black domestic workers. Well, one day I stood in line to meet her. When I got to her, she was smiling. I told her, you won't be smiling when you hear what I've got to say to you. 98% of black women were maids. They ain't never did no drugs. They ain't never laid down and screwed white boys. They might have if they'd had the chance, but they didn't. That was my mama you was talking about. I couldn't be too hard on her, though, because she helped open the door for black actors. Marian Anderson sings on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Marian Anderson had a dignity about her that a lot of people didn't associate with black folks. She was a great singer, but it wasn't even her singing that got all the attention. Hell, we'd heard high notes in church like the ones she hit. What made her so famous was what happened in Washington, D.C. in 1939. The world was watching then. She was born in Philadelphia in 1897. Her daddy sold coal and ice at the train station, and her mama had taught school in Virginia even though she didn't have a degree. Up in Philly, white women with no degree could teach school, but not black ones. So she ended up working as a cleaning woman and taking in folks' laundry. The family went to a Baptist church. Marian Anderson's aunt liked her singing and told her she ought to join the choir, which she did at age 6. Anderson always gave her aunt credit for her becoming a singer. After she finished high school, Marian applied to the Philadelphia Academy of Music. They told her flat out, we don't take colored. But she took private lessons, and in 1925 she won the top prize in a contest that the New York Philharmonic put on. After that she started singing around the country, well, as much as she could. A lot of places didn't want a black woman singing. After a while, Anderson had had enough of that crap, so she went to Europe, where she got treated better. Jean Sibelius, a famous Finnish composer, heard Anderson sing and was so impressed that he asked her over to his place and wined and dined her. He even started writing music for her. She was getting treated the way she should have been treated back home. Anderson soon built up a big following, but even that didn't make a difference to racists back in her home country. She'd land singing gigs in different places in the States, then get there only to learn that the hotel she wanted to stay in or the restaurant where she wanted to eat wasn't going to let her in. That's how deep race hatred ran. She was a famous singer, but she wasn't good enough to pay to sleep in their beds or eat their food. You know where she was allowed to sleep once, though? She went to sing at Princeton University and couldn't get a room, but Albert Einstein let her stay at his house. Einstein was the smartest man the world had ever seen, and he was against racial prejudice. Then came the incident that got everybody's attention. In 1939, the Daughters of the American Revolution wouldn't let Anderson sing in front of a mixed-race audience at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. Now, to give them credit, a whole bunch of the DAR's members quit over that. One of them was the First Lady at the time, Eleanor Roosevelt. She and the President helped arrange it so that Anderson could sing outside on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. 75,000 people attended the outstanding performance. The damage was already done to America's reputation, though. Reporters from around the world swooped in to write about how America, the land of the free, wasn't free enough to let a black woman sing in a concert hall. To tell the truth, that's how a lot of race progress has been made in America. The country gets shamed into doing things it doesn't want to do. Charlie Parker. Ever heard the saying, cruel to be kind? The jazz alto sax player Charlie Parker, they called him Bird, found out how true that is. Bird came from two Kansas cities, born in the one in Kansas in 1920, raised in the one in Missouri. In that second one, he worked hard to be a jazz musician. As a teenager, he bit off more than he could chew, one time anyway. He took his saxophone on the bandstand with some older musicians. One of them was the drummer Papa Joe Jones. Papa Joe didn't mess around. If you got on the stand with him, you'd better know what you were doing, or he'd let you know right quick. Bird was no exception. He started playing with Papa Joe and couldn't keep up, and finally Papa took one of his big old shiny cymbals off his drum kit and threw it. Some say he threw it at the middle of the stage. Some say he threw it at Bird's head. Either way, it landed with a crash so loud they probably heard it back in the other Kansas city. And when it landed, Bird wasn't sleeping, but that crash woke him up. That's what I'm saying about cruel to be kind. What Papa Joe did was cruel, but he did Bird a favor. Because after that, Bird saw what he had to do. He started practicing that horn like nobody you ever saw. After a while, nobody could touch him. He played like he had rockets at the end of his fingers. He soon became known around Kansas City, Missouri in Jay McShann's band. Then in 1939, he moved to New York City, and that's where he really made his contribution. He met Dizzy Gillespie, the trumpeter, who could play as fast as Bird could, and the two of them and some others played all night in clubs in Harlem, and that's where bebop was born. Back then the clubs had what they called cutting contests, with each musician trying to stop the others, playing fast to keep out the chumps. But not just by playing fast. You'd be playing and struggling to keep up, and maybe you almost could, and then you'd change the key of the song, and suddenly you were eating some dust. And then they'd change the key of the song, and suddenly you were eating some dust. Sounds like a mean game. Here's a story about Bird that's in a couple of books. This is how much Bird knew about music. Not just jazz, but all music, including classical. This is what a genius he was. One night he was playing in a club, and Igor Stravinsky walked in. Stravinsky was Russian, one of the most important classical composers of the time. He was to 20th century classical music what Bird was to jazz, and that's saying something. Anyway, Bird was playing, and his trumpeter, Red Rodney, whispered in his ear that Stravinsky had just sat down in the audience. Bird didn't even look at Stravinsky, but then in the solo he was playing, he worked in a little bit of Stravinsky's music from the Firebird Suite. He fit that music into what he was already playing like you'd fit a bolt onto a nut. Stravinsky laughed so hard he pounded his tabletop and his drink splashed on people nearby. That's a good story. Bird was a wild man, loved to clown. He liked to throw around fancy words to be funny, like calling Dizzy Gillespie my worthy constituent. And while you were still figuring out what he'd said, he'd start playing some of his lightning fast, out of this world music, and then you'd have to figure that stuff out. Now, racist whites like to say Martin Luther King Jr. was a communist, but if anybody was a communist, it was Bird, because he treated money like it belonged to everybody. He'd cheat the members of the bands he led and keep the money, but then he'd give you every cent out of his pocket if you needed it. Like a lot of geniuses, like most folks in fact, Bird had some bad habits. Except Bird's habits weren't just bad, they were deadly. When he wasn't playing music, he was shooting heroin. And when he wasn't doing either of those, he was drinking. That stuff took its toll. After he died at the home of his friend, the Baroness Panonica de Königswerter. Wow, that's quite a name. Panonica de Königswerter. The coroner said he was around 60 years old when Bird wasn't but 34. What? He did a lot with those 34 years, though. And just like Bird's knowledge of music went beyond jazz, his impact on music went beyond jazz, too. The jazz sax man, John Coltrane, now that was a bad dude. What he did came out of what Bird did, and Train influenced all kinds of musicians. Train played fast and hard. You never saw a dude that intense. And he had this drummer, Elvin Jones, who used to play so hard, he'd make Train play that much faster and harder. But it wasn't just other jazz musicians digging that stuff. John Densmore, the white drummer for the Doors, one of the biggest rock groups of all time. Oh great, I'm gonna get banned from YouTube here for that. The drummer for the Doors, one of the biggest rock groups of all times, said he used to check out how Elvin Jones drove Train, and that made Densmore drive the Doors lead singer Jim Morrison, and you can trace that all the way back to Bird. That's why in so many cases, if you're talking about American culture, you're really talking about black culture. But back to Bird. He left behind a whole lot of 2 and 3 minute records. Ornithology, Yardbird Suite, Cool Blues, Relaxin' at Camarillo. He named that one for the mental hospital where he had to chill out for a while. Scrapple from the Apple, Clacked Ovised's Tene, Parker's Mood, and a whole bunch more. They needed to be only 2 or 3 minutes long because they had more notes in them than most songs. That's how fast Parker and the rest of those dudes could play. Fast and dazzling. But sometimes those songs were moving too. Bird had speed and soul. He's making me want to check out some of these records. And I should. Miles Davis, Billie Holiday, Nina Simone, and Real Defiance. Miles Davis, jazz trumpeter, composer, band leader. He was a smooth, tough motherfucker. He didn't talk much. He let his music speak for him. Off the bandstand, he didn't make a lot of noise, but you didn't want to mess with him. On the stand, he played some of the most beautiful music you ever heard in your life. Music that seemed to have in it all the pain and mournfulness and hope that black folks ever felt. That shows you black people at our best, fierce when we have to be, creating beauty when we have the chance. That movie they just made about Miles was bullshit. They made up that stuff about the guns and the car chase because they think black people and violence go together like red beans and rice. And Don Cheadle, who directed the movie and played Miles, he admitted that to get the movie financed, they had to put a white co-star in it. That shows you what we're dealing with. Miles would have not been pleased. He understood racism at its highest level like most dark-skinned men do. He was the first musician to have a black woman on an album cover. Imagine if black folks had all the power and white folks wanted to make a movie about Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence, but to get it made, they had to put a made-up black man in there. But to looking over Jefferson's shoulder while he was writing and saying, okay, all right, life, liberty, yeah, good. You're making me proud, Tom. Don't forget pursuit of happiness. What do you think white folks would say? It would be 5 words. Would the words be a beautiful celebration of diversity? Or would they be, what's that N-word doing there? You get only one guess. That film didn't tell you anything about what Miles did, like being part of the bebop revolution with Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Thelonious Monk, playing music so hip and fast and complex that people are still in awe of what they did, with tunes like Donna Lee and bebop, like inventing the cool style of jazz in the 1950s with the record Birth of the Cool, like giving the world Kind of Blue, the best-selling jazz album of all time, and one of the most beautiful records ever made by anybody anywhere. Like spearheading jazz rock fusion in the late 1960s with Bitches Brew. That's right, Bitches Brew. And all through it, Miles was smooth and hard as black glass. Here's one thing, though. People talk about how defiant Miles was because when he was on the bandstand, he'd turn his back on the people who'd paid to see him. Man, when jazz musicians started playing their solos, they get so deep into them that they close their eyes. Miles might have turned his back on the crowd because he forgot where they were at. He's just theorizing, though. Anyway, if you want to talk about some black musicians being defiant, let's talk about 2 women. Billie Holiday and Nina Simone. Billie Holiday, she was different from Ella Fitzgerald, who was singing at the same time. Ella had that range. She hit notes up past where you couldn't see without a telescope. Listen to Ella, you think, man, let me just sit back and enjoy this, 'cause ain't no way I could do it. But Billie had that easy, lazy sound to her voice that almost made you think you could sing just as well as her. Till you tried it. That was her secret weapon. She made it sound so easy to do. She teamed up with Lester Young on saxophone. She'd sing and he'd play. wearing that pork pie hat and holding that sax sideways, and listening to them play together was like hearing the sound of love and affection. Billy was the one who nicknamed him Prez for president. But my point about Billie Holiday is she recorded that song Strange Fruit about lynching. That was in 1939. Back then, in some parts of the country, if you were a black man, you could find yourself on a chain gang for not getting out of the way of a white person on the sidewalk. That's what was going on when Billy sang these words. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Now that's real defiance. Then you had Nina Simone. Now that lady had some talent. Number 6 out of 8 children in a family that was sub-poor. You hear me? They would have had to borrow some money just to have no money. But Nina started playing piano at age 3 and had so much talent that she studied classical music at Juilliard. Those folks don't let in just anybody, and if you want to know what an understatement is, that there is an understatement. But all that classical training didn't knock the feeling and soul out of her voice. You want to hear some feeling? You want to feel something yourself? Listen to her sing Feeling Good. And if you want to know what scat singing is all about, listen to what she does at the end of that song. But my point about her is that in 1964 she recorded Mississippi Goddamn, which is one hell of a song. While black folks were having fire hoses and dogs trained on them, Nina sang. Picket lines, school boycotts, they try to say it's a communist plot. All I want is equality for my sister, my brother, my people, and me. You don't have to live next to me. Just give me my equality. That's defiance too. Miles may have turned his back on his audience, but Nina didn't turn her back on her people. Billy neither. God damn. Jackie Wilson. You can't always look at what a person is doing now and know what he might do. The singer Jackie Wilson proved that. He was born in 1934 in Detroit. He started singing at an early age because he went to church with his mama and heard the singing there. But he started doing some other things early too, like drinking wine and getting into trouble. The dude wasn't but 9 when he started drinking. Oh. When he was a teenager, they sent him twice to a juvenile facility. He learned to box in there. Well, he boxed. Hard to say if he ever learned to box with his Golden Gloves record was when his Golden Gloves record was 2-8. He won 2 fights, so he must have learned something. Maybe he couldn't fight too well, but he sure knew how to do some other things. He kept getting girls pregnant until the daddy of one of the girls made him marry her, and Jackie wasn't but 17. Now all that might not make you think, here's somebody who's going to leave his mark on the world, but he was, and he did. Maybe he wasn't exactly Floyd Mayweather, and Jackie sure didn't know a thing about birth control. But when he got going on his solo singing career, that dude was smooth. They called him Mr. Excitement. As a performer, he influenced Elvis Presley, James Brown, and Michael Jackson. Here's what I mean by smooth. James Brown would sing, and when he started to dance, you'd think, well, here's James dancing now. But Jackie Wilson was so smooth, doing it all at once, that you were almost too busy listening to that nice tenor voice to see what he was doing with his body. So smooth he made that stuff look easy. He'd get going on Lonely Teardrops or Baby Workout, dressed like somebody going to a business meeting, and he'd hit those high notes like it was no big deal, so you almost didn't notice what his feet were doing. Lorraine Hansberry and A Raisin in the Sun. The Great Migration is when black folks left the South and moved north and west to places like New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and Chicago. In most of the places we went to, we got packed into segregated neighborhoods like pants in a suitcase. Landlords knew we couldn't go anywhere else, so they charged us an arm and both legs for places that should have been condemned. That weren't fit for people to live in. That weren't fit for people to live in, excuse me. Hell, even the rats and roaches were protesting. One of Langston Hughes' poems, Harlem, goes like this. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? A dream deferred. Hughes was talking about what happens to black folks when our dreams are not allowed to come to fruition because the dreamers are black. What's the poem got to do with black folks moving from the South? Lorraine Hansberry used a line from that poem, A Raisin in the Sun, as the title of her play about a black family all bunched up together in a rundown Chicago apartment a few years after World War II. 3 generations, the mother, her 35-year-old son, and 20-year-old daughter, the son's wife, and their little boy, all in a place so small they have to share a bathroom with the neighbors, have to wake up early in the morning just so they can take a crap before somebody else gets in there. Because of job discrimination, the son, Walter Lee, has to work as a chauffeur driving white folks around, which won't even pay for him to move somewhere with his wife and son. He's got a dream of opening up a liquor store. But what bank is going to lend money to Walter Lee? His dream gets deferred, and he's about ready to explode. Walter Lee hopes his mama will lend him the money, though, because she's getting a check from an insurance company for her dead husband. At first, his mama doesn't want to lend him the money. She says, "We ain't no business people. We just plain working folks." And Walter Lee's wife tells her, Ain't nobody business people till they go into business. And right there, that's one of the saddest things about people being beaten down. They think they're not supposed to do any better. Ain't nobody business people till they go into business. Meaning just because you've never done something before and you don't know other black people doing it, that doesn't mean you can't do it. A Raisin in the Sun was the first play by a black woman to be performed on Broadway. That was 1959. A few years later, Lorraine Hansberry died of cancer. Wasn't but 34. Wow. She left behind a lesson for us, though, because in the end, the play is about not giving up on yourself and not letting anybody tell you who you are or what you're worth. It's also about people taking care of one another. Thank you for joining me. Tune into the next episode and we'll finish the chapter, I think. And in the meantime, hit that like and subscribe button. And hit that notification bell, too. Because YouTube has been known to unsubscribe people. Thank you very much.